Nebraska has a secret weapon both on and off the field. Who is it? We'll tell you next.
You are Locked On Nebraska, your daily Nebraska Cornhuskers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Good morning, and thanks for making Locked On Nebraska your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply.
All right, welcome in on this Wednesday. I am Mitch Sherman from The Athletic. Connor Happer of Omaha 1620 The Zone is with me today. As always, we are running a little bit late. Sorry for that. We'll get to
you can throw me under the bus. Come on, tell
we'll get
people
to an explanation about that in the second segment. It's fine. No problem. Everybody's still going to get their news. But you heard us right. You heard Connor right in the open. Nebraska rolled out a secret weapon on the field, off the field, on Tuesday at media availability. And folks, his name is James Williams. You may remember James from last season, or you may not remember him. He played in just 4 games, had 2 sacks. Then he sat out the last 2 games of the year when Nebraska faced Wisconsin and Iowa to redshirt. He is a sophomore. He's 6'6". He's bulked up this offseason to 250 pounds. And so you're saying, all right, so what's interesting about that? Well, on Tuesday, he came to the interview room at the Hawks Championship Center, the last interview of a long day. I think, camp gets long for all of us. We were going through the motions a little bit. And then Williams started talking, and it was like music to all of our ears. I think you will love him when you hear him because he is a human soundbite. Do you agree, Connor?
I have researched. I have done the. I've looked at the information that is presented, and yes, I want to say first about James Williams. So he played in 4 games last year, and we could discuss this afterwards too. But Mitch and I were talking about this yesterday via text. I don't know that I'd ever seen his face before. I don't know what he looked like. And so when he shows up with the big mop top black hair, I'm like, who is this guy again? And then you come to find out who he is very quickly. Mitch, please introduce us to him.
Yeah, let's just go through some clips of James talking here from Tuesday in Lincoln, and then we can analyze at the end. So here's James talking about his readiness to play this year.
Feel stronger, bigger. I have a lot more reps now. Stuff that was like different work that we did that was a lot harder for me now. It just kind of feels rudimentary. So,
okay. Here's James talking about Terrence Knighton's options out of the bullpen, so to speak.
With how much depth we have in the room, I kind of see it as like Coach T. Knight has like 13 different pitches he can use, and I'm his cutter, like Kai Wallen is his slider, like Sua is his. I'm sorry, I really don't know baseball that well. Ignore that.
Phone ringing. All right. Here's James talking about one of his newest teammates, David Hufkin, the big exchange student from Europe that Nebraska discovered this summer.
We just added a new kid named David. He's from Germany. He's huge. He has size 20 feet, and he's 6'8".
Yep. Thanks for introducing him to us. Here he is talking about everyone on the D line, including Keona Davis, a name that we have come to know.
I genuinely think, especially in our defensive line room, we have the best in the country. Guys like Cam, Kai, Nash, Ty, Jamari, the big 3, but then Sua, Vince, even Keona Davis, like you guys will hear his name soon. He is really good. He will be the next big thing.
Awesome. And finally, here we have James Williams talking about his attempts to get bigger in the offseason.
I've had a problem. I have a really high metabolism. I just feel like keeping food down for me is hard, and even eating is hard. But T Knight has been huge on that in that role. But so have like guys in the room like Sua and Vince, and even Willis McGahee. Like they're all yelling at me constantly about making sure I eat and making sure I have something to eat with me at all times. Like it's really hard sometimes, especially when like I feel like I'm about to puke and they're throwing another sandwich in front of me, right? And like they're like, you have to eat this. It's hard, but I know it's for the best for me.
Okay.
Great
Lots
stuff.
there to digest. No pun intended. He is very honest. I like this. He's a breath of fresh air. He is just telling us what he thinks. He forgot to turn his phone off before he went to the podium. Somebody called him. It's all just very, very enjoyable.
You know who he kind of reminds me of, and obviously this comes off way different, because of the stature of player that they are and were. He kind of sounded like Taylor Martinez. Taylor Martinez did interviews kind of like this as well, kind of just like a little bit of everywhere, said what was on his mind. Now, unfortunately for Taylor, he was Nebraska's best player and he was the quarterback for 4 years, and he was an often maligned player with his coach and all the stuff that was going on, the drama surrounding him. It's better when you have a guy like that who's kind of a spacehead, who is maybe, like the fifth or sixth or whatever defensive lineman. Not to say that he's not a key piece for Nebraska. He is, but he's certainly not the starting quarterback. It takes on a little bit of a different light. He just, I appreciate that because he kind of takes the conversation wherever he wants. And after my heart, because he throws in a baseball reference, he definitely knew 2 baseball pitches. Not sure if
Who's
he
the
could
fastball.
Who's the fastball? Yeah,
I
right.
want to know who is T Knight's fastball. We should. That was just a follow-up question that was like right there. I'm sure he would have had a good answer.
Yeah, you could have had 6 more follow-ups to the baseball question to see how far we could have taken it. But interesting guy, and I don't think we it was a surprise to people when James Williams showed up in games last year. And it was like, whoa, okay, this is something. And then he got 2 sacks. And I mean, think about that. Nebraska got 2 free sacks last year out of the 32 that they had. 2 of them were just free because they came from a guy who redshirted. And he comes back this year. Obviously, I don't think he needs to step into like this feature role or anything like that. Whatever you can get from him is great. And if he's taking the next step, I mean, that's even better for the defensive line.
He's one of those guys, and there are several on the team. When you get to high level athletics, I assume if you went to Ohio State or Georgia, half the team or more would be like this. But he's one of those guys who just has this terrible struggle. I know the general public really empathizes with him in being able to keep weight on. Like he just eats and he eats and he eats and he's still losing weight. So like someone, and he talked about his metabolism. But that's generally a sign of someone who is an elite level athlete, and that's not what you generally expect to find out of the post grad camp. So this makes the whole thing more interesting because James Williams, and he touted Jalen Gramstad, who was Nebraska's main find at the post grad camp this year because he's a quarterback. There was a receiver that Nebraska got who's on the 120 also at the post grad camp, but we've heard most about Gramstad. Well, James Williams was this guy last year. And if Nebraska was playing by the rules that will exist a year from now, where you've got 105 in camp and something like that on the roster, he wouldn't be on this team.
Good point.
Because he was like 140 on the roster a year ago at this time and then worked his way up as the season went along. They pulled him off the scout team to make him a third down pass rush specialist. So he's interesting just from the get-go without having said anything yesterday. And then he came in and, entertained us for 15 minutes, and it was all that much more enjoyable.
Yeah. So like, I actually think the baseball analogy is really, really good. It's a good way to kind of frame up Nebraska's defensive line. Like now this is a real deep cut, but like, people always talk about how Seth Lugo has like 10 or 11 different pitches that he could throw, or like Bartolo Colon had like 9 different versions of his fastball or something like that. I think that's like kind of what they're going for. Now you have your bread and butter, and he mentioned it. It's Jamari, Nash, and Ty, and then you go from there and you mix up. Maybe you're only mixing that weird knuckle curveball in like for 6 plays a game or something like that. But if you can get production, if you can get really good reps out of those 6 plays or 10 plays or 12 plays or whatever it is, then like you're going to be pretty airtight on the defensive side of the ball. And like, that's the kind of depth that Nebraska has created here. Like, we could continue on this conversation in the next segment, but like it brings up a really interesting, kind of thought about this defense and how many people they can play and how many people they will play.
Yeah, let's hold that thought and talk a little bit more about James Williams and like what players in his role might mean for the Nebraska defense this fall, because we heard from a couple of guys in that situation on Tuesday during interviews. So that is coming up after the break. I want to remind you before we go to break to follow us on Twitter at LockedOnNEB. Make sure you're subscribing to us and liking, downloading our podcast on all of the platforms, Apple, Spotify, at Locked On Nebraska. That's where you can find the podcast. Locked On NEB is our Twitter handle, and lockedonneb@gmail.com is our email. Send us an email. Let us know what you think of the show, what you'd like us to talk about as we get closer to the season. All right. Next, we will get into depth on the Nebraska defense and continue the James Williams conversation. Okay, Mitch Sherman here for Game Time. Want to take a minute and tell you about the best place that you can get tickets to Major League Baseball, but not just Major League Baseball. Maybe it's a college football game that you're looking for in late August or early September or mid-September or even in November. Go on Game Time and check it out, because Game Time is the key to getting tickets easier and faster. It is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. If you want to watch a game, get to a game in Kansas City or somewhere else in the Midwest during the pennant race, go check it out. They've got all-in pricing, no fees at checkouts. At checkout, there's deals for specific zones of the stadium. Game Time has flexible customer service. It is all there. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with the Game Time app. Here's how you do it. Create an account. Use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. That's $20 off a Kansas City Royals game in August with playoff implications. Terms apply. Again, create an account. Redeem the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. It's at gametime.co, and the app is on the App Store. Lowest price guaranteed.
All right, we're back here on a Wednesday. Connor Happer, Mitch Sherman with you. Once again, apologies for getting this up a little later this morning.
What happened?
I'll just say that one of us, Mitch, has lost all sense of what day it is, what time it is. There were storms. I'm gonna throw out every excuse in the book. But I did not wake up.
It did rain last night. You're right. I heard it.
Yeah, there was storms. I got a 2-week-old kid. I mean, plenty of excuses. That's what I'm going to throw out there.
You are totally excused, man. I mean, I'm impressed that you're here and ready to do the pod in any state at all here in this state of early parenthood that you're going through. Are you back on the air on 1620 next week? Is that right?
Next week,
okay.
We're gearing up for the season.
That's the true test. That's the real test. Are you going to make it to the show by 10 o'clock?
It's that, and then preparing for the show, the entire thing. Yeah, I'll just say that it's been a very nice 3 weeks to be available to at least help a little bit, have a helping hand in raising my child. But mom will continue to step up.
You're helping a lot. I'm sure that just your support, your availability, everything that you're doing, I know it's appreciated, even if you're not getting that feedback necessarily. I've been through this, and there were times where I did not receive that feedback, but later on in years to come, it will be noted that you were there to help.
Okay, that's great. I'll look forward to that whenever that day comes. You know who else's availability is appreciated? James Williams. Thank you for being available
to
to the
James.
media. Thank you for being available to the Nebraska defense. Is there anything else on James before we turn it into a bigger conversation about their defense in general?
I thought like his awareness of everything was pretty interesting. Other than the fact that I'm not quite sure if he understands like the intensity of the interest in Nebraska football. He like we heard in one of the clips there, he said, "Yeah, we got this guy David on the team. Like, wait till you guys hear about him. He's a big dude from Germany." And we're there were some smiles in the room at that moment. Like,
yeah, we know.
What? Guess what? We've heard of him. We've talked to him. We knew like the second that he got offered at the camp in Texas, but that may have just been like the way that James talks, and he may be fully aware that like we've all geeked out already over David Huffkin. But it was funny the way that he presented that, because there's an innocence to just acting like, I'm just out here, chatting about football with you guys. I played in junior college. Is this different? I mean, I know I get fed better and like there's a bigger stadium, but like, is it different than Iowa State? Yes, it's different in like every imaginable way. And he obviously understands that from having been on the field last year. But he also talked about his decision that he made, to redshirt, because he got to the 4-game limit after the Maryland game. And he was not himself against Maryland. Like at that point, he was in the 220s with his weight, having a hard time moving and using his athleticism to the best of his abilities. And he wanted to get after Talia Tagovailoa in that game and like help Nebraska win it in the fourth quarter when Maryland had to throw the ball. And he was a step slow, and he recognized that. So we went into the last 2 weeks, and Matt Rule talked to him, and it was like, okay, you can play against Wisconsin and you can play against Iowa, and then you'll be a junior next year. And James was like, well, Iowa doesn't throw the ball, so I'm not going to play against Iowa more than a couple of reps. And like, do I want to waste a year to play not waste, but do I want to use a year just to play in this one game against Wisconsin when I'm not myself physically? So he's a smart guy for sure. Cool. And I just hope there are big things on the horizon for him this year, because that means he will make more appearances in that room and in front of the cameras.
Yeah, that would be great for everybody. And once again, if he notches a couple sacks, then you're starting to do. So this is where it evolves into a bigger conversation about the defense. Like, you're starting to do the math on, hey, is this guy good for 2.5 sacks or 3 sacks? And then you start adding it up across the defensive line. Oh my gosh, they're going to play like 6, 7, 8 guys, including the next, Ndamukong Suh maybe, or something like that. And then,
that's key,
a couple sacks from linebackers and whatever. And you're like, you know what? I think this pass rush could be pretty good. Like we've always said, in the aggregate, you're building it around a whole bunch of guys. Mitch, I was just looking at the just randomly, I was looking at the participation chart for the Iowa game last year. It's just something I do.
That's what I read before I go to bed.
Yeah, it's like the New York Times crossword puzzle and participation charts. They played 21 guys against Iowa last year. Mm-hmm. And if we were to look at the other games, I would imagine that the Iowa game would have probably been on the lower side. They kind of had it probably hemmed in as far as who they were playing by that time.
And James Williams didn't play.
And
there were some injuries.
Iowa's not particularly diverse in what they do. That's still 21 guys. So I imagine they're probably playing about 25 guys a game on the defensive
early in the
side.
year. That was the case. Yeah. And it was, and I remember, I mean, it was shocking. Like it was like Nebraska's playing close games against Minnesota. Colorado didn't turn out to be a close game, but it was for 2.5 quarters. And there are 24, 25 defensive players out there. And it's like this Tony White, like, he really wants to build his depth.
So how does that go into this year where, last year it made a lot of sense, right? Build depth, create a situation where you could play a whole bunch of guys going into 2024 and really, figure out who your guys are and win games. Now, I wonder if they view that as like playing a bunch of guys as a winning formula, or as something that they had to do in 23 to create depth going into 24. Where do you come out on that?
Winning formula. I think they knew that they had an offense last year that was challenged, and that the defense would be on the field for a lot of reps, and that the only way they were going to have a team in November that could play good defensive football was to not have those guys out of gas, like to save some energy. And the only way to do that, you can't pace yourself in a game unless you go take a seat on the sideline and the number 2 comes in. They did a lot of it at every level. Like they're talking this year, and it's just an extension of what last year looked like, about having 8 defensive linemen who can play. And you start to look at the players who are toward the bottom of that list, and it's like, yeah, they deserve to be on the field. Like James Williams, that's kind of where he's at now. I mean, he might be in on the first series of the game against UTEP or Colorado in a few weeks because they play him situationally. But just as far as like, you talked about Terrence Knight and having 13 pitches, like James is like 8 or 9 on his pitch list. So they want to do that again. And it's the point is, so when the schedule gets tough in November and the rough and tough, come to the top, like that's when championships are won, and that's when Nebraska wants to be at its best. Your defense is not worn out.
I think that works as long as, and I think this is the case for Nebraska, as long as you know who your guys, who's going to be out there when it's time to make an important play, on a big third down in the fourth quarter. And I do think there is actually like a pretty clear delineation in that top line, because we've talked about this before. As many guys as they're going to play and as many young guys as they're going to play, especially in the defensive backfield, they're still old. I mean, like in totality on defense. So there's a pretty clear line in between like dudes you can ride and like the dudes who can play. I think there's a difference there. And so I think Nebraska has both, which should be able to, keep its stamina up toward the end of the year, toward the end of games, and make big plays when they need them. It feels like a best of both worlds situation.
As long as your personnel fits the objective that you've set out to achieve, then you're in a good place. And we saw it on display with the players who talked to the media on Tuesday. We heard from Elijah Judy, who has reshaped his body and is 280 pounds or 285 pounds and looks now like somebody who can help Nebraska on the defensive line add depth. We mentioned James Williams a few times on this show already. We heard from Prince Will, who I think is more like a co-number 1 with MJ Sherman at Jack linebacker. But we heard people talking about Vincent Shavers yesterday. We heard people talking about Steph Thompson yesterday, the Syracuse transfer. In the secondary, Tony White brought up Mario Buford. A couple other true freshmen have had their names called. Like they go what? Like 9 deep, 10 deep in the secondary, like 4 to 5 at inside linebacker, 2 to 3 at Jack linebacker, and then like 8 across the front 3 for the defensive line. That's a lot of players, and they're not going to play 30. They're not going to play 28, 29 guys against Colorado this year, but I don't think. But the depth is there. And it helps you if you have an injury, and it helps you be ready to go at the end of the season.
No doubt about it. So interesting thing to watch. Coming back in the third segment, we'll discuss what happened yesterday, and not necessarily news items of the day, but more of a vibe. Something in the air yesterday made the hype train kind of get off the tracks a little bit. We'll discuss that when we return. But first, a thank you for making Locked On Nebraska your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, checked out the Locked On College Football podcast, please. There is plenty of season previews, and of course all the summer conversations that are beginning to fade away, and as we transition into football. Locked On College Football. It's available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Okay, back for the third and final segment of this Wednesday show of the Locked On Nebraska podcast. I'm Mitch Sherman of The Athletic. Connor Happer of 1620 The Zone in Omaha is here with me. So, yeah, you mentioned this before the break, Connor. Tuesday was an interesting day on the national landscape as it related to Nebraska. Maybe it's just that we are like delirious from the monotony and boring nature of preseason camp at this moment. It's hard to see that August 31st from where we're at. It's tough to remember July 31st when camp opened. So I think people feel that, especially for you, who've lived like 2 years since the end of July. Did you see? This is somewhat under the radar in Nebraska, but I noticed it on social media. Jake Crane of the Crane Company Pod, which is somewhat of a national brand, he talked up Nebraska as his bet of the preseason to go over 7.5 wins this year, and that was like, wow. So you're saying they're going to win 8 games, and you feel really good about it. And I wonder, like, is this a one-off, or like, are people around the country believing in Matt Rule in Nebraska that much?
No, I've seen things like that. I don't know about. I mean, I think there was some real confidence behind that, because like if you're making them your over under bet of the preseason, you not only think they're going to win more than 7.5 games, 8 games or more. You probably feel like they're going to clear that by a win or two.
It's not your bet of the season, bet of the preseason, or bet of the day, whatever.
Interesting. One thing that not being like totally locked in for the last 3 weeks while I've been on paternity leave from the day job has allowed me to do. I think it's allowed me to kind of step back and say, like, what is going on here? This happens to us every August, and I undoubtedly would have been sucked up in it as I am every year. Like I think if you pull the average Joe Husker fan, you ask them what you think of the season on, after the season ends, and then in spring ball, and then before August, and then after August, like the day before the first game, the biggest jump might be during that month of August. It's just, it happens every single year. And it's because of stuff like this, preseason publications. And there's a lot of national people who are high on Nebraska for good reason. But I think you could take one thing and maybe make too much out of it, or do some addition and add and juice the numbers a little bit. Like, I think 7.5 is a really good number, because it straddles the line of, man, do I really think they're going to win 8 games? I feel like they could and should win 7. That'd be a nice year for them. 8 feels like you'd be doing a little bit more. And then obviously you go any further beyond that, you're doing a lot more. Is it possible? Of course. But that's why 7.5 is a great number. And that's why they build all those big buildings in Vegas.
8's going to require multiple things to go right that just haven't gone right for Nebraska in several years. Like, historically, those things have happened well for Nebraska, but not after 2014.
You're going to have to win a game you weren't supposed to win in the preseason. Simple.
Yeah, most likely. In all of the ones, or most of the ones that you are expected to win. So interesting that you say, like, you've felt this vibe of like positive energy here in August. And I agree with you that, like, that's a typical August. I've actually felt like this last week, like since Teddy Prohaska was hurt, and then the comments that came out, we spent our whole Monday show talking about Matt Rule's dress down of the team during the Chasing 3 documentary that came out of the Saturday, August 3rd scrimmage practice. Sorry, that wasn't a scrimmage. And then some of Rule's comments after the Saturday, August 10th scrimmage, where he closed it to observers and, talked about turnovers. And then we heard from Tony White on Tuesday saying that the tackling wasn't good in that scrimmage. Like, I felt like locally, maybe there's been this kind of the tendency to go, whoa, hold on. Like, is this not the team that we thought it was going to be? But nationally, there's been more. And I will say, I'm not buying into that. I think this is just the grind and the doldrums of this time of August. Like, what are you supposed to talk about? Like, the coaches are not going to be like singing the praises of everything that's happening if they're being real. It's early August. Like, you have things to work on. Absolutely. You should. 100%. You better have things to work on when you've had 7 consecutive losing seasons. That's still who this team is. But nationally, they've continued to pick up steam. The other one I wanted to bring up was Brett Ciancia of the Pick 6 previews, which is a cool publication. I've got the booklet, and I know he's been a guest on your radio station. So I recommend checking out his website at a minimum, or maybe even getting his publication. But so he's got projections for offensive and defensive units in the Big Ten. So remember, 18-team Big Ten. He puts Nebraska 7 with its offense and 4th with its defense. The only teams to rank ahead of Nebraska in both categories are Oregon and Ohio State.
So in order, like analytically, you look at Nebraska and you're like, wow, this is a team that is primed for a turnaround. Look at all these like astronomically horrible numbers from last year. They got better at quarterback. They should be fine on offense. They should be really good on defense. They were minus 17 in the turnover margin. They turned the ball over 31 times last year. That number should be better. And it will be. Like, it will be. But what you're asking for in order to flip Nebraska from a sub 500 team, which they have been since what, 2016 at this point. I mean, it's been 15. No,
15 was you're right. 15 was 16 was the first of the
16. They went to the bowl game and they
yeah. Sorry,
you're asking.
Mike Riley had a 9-win season. Man, he just
People forget. You're asking to flip that all the way to the positive, right? It's just a huge jump. Remember, Nebraska has not had. I mean, if I pull up my turnover margin spreadsheet that I have, they haven't had a positive turnover margin since that year, 2016. They were 0 in 2019. They've been minus every year. So like Rule talked about going from minus 17 to 7, that's a gigantic jump.
Plus 7. Yeah.
But if you're counting on them winning 8 or 9 games, that's what they'll have to do. And it's just a hard thing to count on.
Yeah. No, right. Plus going 24 in the other direction in turnovers is
huge,
is remarkable if they can get that done. But that's where he's setting his sights. And guess what? That's why he has high expectations. And that's why he's not satisfied with what he's seen so far in preseason camp. Like, if you want to go in a 24 turnover turnaround from one year to the next, you better be riding those guys to do everything right, or get as close to being everything right as they can when you're leading up to the first game. So,
yeah.
All right. Interesting conversation today. So we'll continue more with some of this national, the national perception about Nebraska and Matt Rule in the Thursday show. And then Friday, we're going to be live from Lincoln. We may be in the press box on Friday if we can get that thing worked out.
Featuring jackhammers.
Did scouting. Yes. Did some scouting up there on Tuesday, and it's looking good. So that's it for the Wednesday show. Thank you again for making Locked On Nebraska your first listen. Now go check out Locked On College Football and make that your second listen. From NIL deals to never-ending conference realignment rumors, Spencer McLaughlin, he's got you ready for an exciting season ahead on the gridiron. You can find Locked On College Football in the description of this show, so you don't need to search. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.